So we continue with Matthew Stiebe, who is Professor of Modern European History at Sheffield Hallam University in UK. You're welcome to speak.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm going to speak today on socialist women and the Great War, and I begin by explaining my own involvement in this project. Before I do so, I'd like to thank the organisers of this conference for inviting me, and I'd also like to acknowledge Ingrid Sharp and Corinne Painter from Leeds University, whose work this jointly is with me. Corinne, Ingrid and I are launching a new project, which is the second book, if you like, or a sequel to the book that we published last year, Women Activists Between War and Peace, to which Dagmar and Julie also contributed, and Veronica Helfert also contributed. She's recently been awarded her PhD at Vienna University on women activists between war and peace. And one of the things that came out of that volume was the need to think again in broader sense about socialist women in the Great War. It's interesting to think both about the chronology of the revolution. We might not begin in 1918. We might not end, we might not begin or end in 1918, but begin in 1914 even, and end in 1921. It's also very interesting to think about the issue of commemoration. It seems like we've been doing the commemoration for a very long time now, but today actually is the 9th of November, so it is actually literally the 100th anniversary of the November Revolution in Germany and in Austria 100 years ago today. So Ingrid and I edited this book, which includes, in many ways, an experimental form of writing with jointly written chapters, which was quite a challenge, but we managed to overcome the various challenges involved in that. And we are planning with this second book, which will also be published by Bloomsbury in, I hope, in 2 or 3 years' time, to have jointly written chapters. So part of my purpose today in this venue and in other venues is to talent spot. If you think that you might be able to make a contribution to this volume, please do not hesitate to contact me or Ingrid. We're still looking for 1 or 2 authors on 1 or 2 of the chapters. The new project has also come out of a play that Ingrid, Corinne and I were involved in on the margins called Women of Action. And it has been playing in Britain and in Kiel, Germany over the last few weeks. If you happen to be in the north of England next week, I've put some leaflets out over there. The play is still running for 1 more week next week in Sheffield and Manchester, Julie. So, Women of Action is a play written by 2 Bradford playwrights about a play. And the play it's about is a play written by the German revolutionary Ernst Toller, who took part briefly in the Bavarian Revolution and the Bavarian Soviet in 1919, and led, allegedly gun in hand, the Red Army's brief victory at the Dachau munitions factory, the only Red Army victory in Munich, just outside Munich, in 1919. He wrote, in 1933, Ernst Toller briefly came to Britain before moving on to the United States. He was an anarchist playwright. He'd been sentenced to death in Munich in 1919 and was unable to live in Bavaria thereafter, but he lived in Germany until 1933. Because he was both German and an anarchist communist, he was watched by the British security services for the whole time that he was in England in 1933, and they noticed that he got involved with the playwright Joan Littlewood, who at that time had her own arguments with people in London and made her way up to Manchester. In Manchester, in the Rusholme Theatre in Manchester, the 2 Littlewood agreed to stage Ernst Toller's play Draw the Fires, which is about the Kiel naval, the Matrosenaufstand, the uprising of the sailors on the 3rd of November 1918 in Kiel. Except that Joan Littlewood fell out with Ernst Toller because she asked, where are the women? There are no women except one barmaid in Ernst Toller's play. And Joan Littlewood became increasingly disillusioned with the play, and it fell apart and was never actually properly staged. And Toller made his way to the United States of America. But this Women of Action is a play about the staging of the play and why Joan Littlewood objected to Ernst Toller's very masculine interpretation of the Kiel Uprising in early November 1918. So we were involved in that, and now it's come to fruition. The leaflets at the back there. And on the back of that, we began thinking about doing this new volume on socialist women and the Great War. My own academic interest in this began when I was working on a completely different project on de-Stalinization in Eastern Europe, and particularly in the GDR in 1956 or in the late 1950s. In the mid to late 1950s, under Khrushchev, the gulags, the Soviet camps were opened up, and among the literally millions of prisoners who were released were a small number of German anti-fascists, the surviving remnants of German exile anti-fascists who had been in Moscow in 1935-36 and who were arrested as supposed dissident communists and sent to the Gulag. A few of these decided on release that they wanted to go to West Germany, but most decided to go back to the GDR, or to the GDR, and these ex-communists caused a real headache to Walter Ulbricht and the leaders of the GDR in 1956 because they were surviving witnesses to the Stalinist terror of the 1930s. Ulbricht, I'm sure, wished that these people didn't exist, that they had all perished in the Gulag. But they had to be brought back to the GDR, a few hundred of them, and they, most of them wanted to and were willing to accept something called political rehabilitation. Political rehabilitation meant getting your party card back. In fact, if you got your party card back, it wasn't so much that your party membership was restored, but your party record was altered again so that you never had left the party, in spite of the 20 years between 35 and 55 when you were an enemy of the party officially. But you were let back you were let back into the party just as when they were expelled in 1935. Their record party membership was completely wiped out. In 1956, they find that they get their party membership back, and they are often become party veterans suddenly, as they've been in the party since 1917, 1918, because their party membership is rewritten in that form. So they go from being outsiders to being honoured, esteemed party veterans. Although they're not given very high-ranking positions in the SED, the ruling party in East Germany, they're often given sort of middle-ranking positions. And in particular, many of them were employed in the Institute for Marxism-Leninism in East Berlin and asked to begin collecting memoirs of party veterans like themselves, and beginning with writing their own memoirs for the party. They, of course, have to leave out the 20 years when they were in the Gulag, and also leave out the fact that many of their relatives or their husbands or wives died in the Gulag. And that means that they have to concentrate on other areas of their autobiographies. Many of the purge victims were ex-Spartakists, members of the original Spartacist League in Germany, founded in 1916 by Luxemburg and Liebknecht, whereas Ulbricht and the dominant faction in the East German Communist Party had been in the USPD, the Independent Social Democrats, and did not join the communists until 1920. So they came back as ex-Spartakists, ordered to write their autobiographies or memoirs for the party archive. The deal about political rehabilitation is that you have your party membership and all the honours that go with that restored. You even have your birthday celebrated in Neues Deutschland, the official party newspaper, every year. But of course, you cannot say anything about what happened to you in the Soviet Union. And therefore, the memoirists tend to concentrate on their early days in the party, and particularly the November Revolution, the Spartacist uprising, and the Ruhr uprising of 1920, when their engagement as socialists first began and their hope and optimism for the dawning of a new age first began. Now, the last thing I need to say about such sources are that most of the survivors of the German anti-fascist survivors of the Soviet gulags were women, because men were more likely to perish in the gulag. Many of the women who came back had lost their husbands and or their sons, and yet they still accepted rehabilitation by the party. Using such autobiographies as sources on socialist women is problematic. These memoirs were written in the late 50s, early 60s as a means of disciplining such returnees, to make sure that they conformed to a script that the party expected them to write to. So in that sense, they are very difficult sources. On the other hand, reading them, I sense underneath the surface, to use a German expression, a certain amount of Eigensinn, a certain amount of, when writing about 1918-19, a certain, between the lines, writing about the Spartakists and their more radical nature, as opposed to the independent socialists who were less revolutionary in 1918. Walter Ulbricht, in 1958, defined the German Revolution as a failed bourgeois revolution. But the Spartakist vision was slightly different. They wanted to talk about a real, genuine proletarian revolution that took place in 1918 and was then defeated. And we can see, but reading between the lines of some of these memoirs, there's about 40 of them in the memoir archive of the SED Party archive, which you can now find in Berlin. I identify in at least half of them a sense of stubbornness, a sense of underneath the surface, a sense of rebelling against the official party line in 1958, and a desire to retell the Spartakist story, which had been repressed really by the official historiography in East Germany, and particularly by Ulbricht and the ruling party. So that's when my interest came in socialist women, and using those sources. Ingrid and Corinne, my partners at the University of Leeds, have found different sources than mine in all kinds of different archives. They went to Kiel in the north of Germany and uncovered, this is partly why we worked on this on the margins of this play, evidence of women having been involved in the initial uprising in Kiel and in the Arbeiterräte, the workers' councils, in 1918 and so forth. So we kind of pooled our sources together, and Corinne is creating a database at the University of Leeds, which will go online eventually, and so far we have 256 women revolutionaries in Germany, and counting. We're adding to it as we continue. That's where our project began, and since then, recently, we have been offered a new contract with Bloomsbury, and our intention is to write this volume with 5 lengthy chapters, all of them multi-authored. And that's why I'm talent spotting partly today. If anyone in the audience feels that they might be able to contribute in some way to any of these particular themed chapters, I'd be very grateful to hear from them. One of our findings is that women's revolutionary activity, we cannot really begin it in 1918. I am defining socialist women here, perhaps a little bit controversially, as those who were to the left of the majority Social Democrats in Germany, who were anti-war and who followed the line taken by the Berner Friedensmanifest, the peace manifesto issued by the Women's Congress, Socialist Women's Congress, that took place in Bern, Switzerland in March 1915 under the chair of Clara Zetkin. And these women in the German context ended up in the USPD or in the KPD, and particularly, first of all, in the Spartacus Bund, the Spartacus League. We're interested in looking at, therefore, women's involvement in food protests, in strikes from 1915 onwards, in the illegal distribution across borders of pamphlets and socialist literature, including copies of the Berner Friedensmanifest. We're interested too in revolutions and revolutionary violence, not in women as victims of violence so much as in the extent to which socialist women were prepared to advocate, even use violence in pursuit of social justice as they saw it. We're interested in how socialist women define suffrage and citizenship, and how they might use discourses around socialism and the need for class warfare as a means of demarcating themselves from so-called bourgeois pacifist women. We're interested in how, this is a particular theme for me, how revolutionary women's lives panned out after the revolution, particularly after the failure of revolutions in Central Europe, and those who, for instance, ended up in exile in Moscow or ended up in exile in Britain and the United States, ended up falling foul either of fascism, Nazism, or of Stalinist communism. And we're interested, Ingrid particularly has been in Germany quite a lot in the last few weeks, in how women's role in the November Revolution in Germany, Austria, is not really being commemorated in the commemorations around the anniversary of the 9th November. So those are our themes, and in particular the last chapter, we're co-writing it with the authors and directors of the play Women of Axion as well. They've taken their play all around the north of England and to Kiel as well. So those are our themes, and I guess in the rest of the lecture I'm going to talk mainly about the themes that I'm interested in, which is looking at really at the first, second and fourth of these themes, the issue of protest up to 1918, the issue of revolutionary violence, and in the issue of looking at life trajectories after war and revolution in the German context. My particular specialism is German-speaking Central Europe, that I'm interested in the wider European context as well, and in networks and transnational issues. When we look at the German and Austrian contexts, we find that one of the key problems in writing about the November Revolution is the notion this was a male revolution. Various historians of the German Revolution, Moritz Vollmer in Amsterdam, Benjamin Seemann in Sheffield, and others have written about the revolution as being, Seemann has written, his imprint has written that when the revolution occurred, its gender was male. This was a revolution led by soldiers and sailors, an anti-militarist revolution aimed at ending the war, but there was little involvement by women. Feminist historians, Gabriele Hauch in Vienna and others have shown how the councils movement was effectively a Männerbund, a band of brothers. Moritz Vollmer has written a very good article in Past and Present, published very recently, I think in August this year, looking at different ways of men who wrote the revolutionary script in 1918 as a disciplined and romantic proletarian assertive revolution. And of course here we find this is in Wilhelmshaven on the 6th of November 1918. The members of the Soldatenrat, the Workers' Council, are liberating the prisoners, the socialist prisoners, from the local jail. We have this image which is we still see today, very much entrenched in the historiography and reinforced by recent writers, of this as being primarily a revolution led by and dominated by men, and indeed the empirical research on the council's movements in both Germany and Austria has showed just how numerically few women were represented on the workers' councils that grew up in November 1918 and the months that followed. And this might lead us into a bit of theory here, separate spheres and the revolutionary self. What I've read into this, and the memory archive that I've looked at in Berlin includes memoirs by men as well as women, male party veterans. Men take it for granted that they are revolutionary subjects. They do not need to construct or justify a revolutionary self. They take it for granted that they are the revolution, that the revolution is male in character, that it has these male traits of being united, forward-looking, logical, disciplined, linear, and led by a Männerbund, a band of brothers. Women in revolutions historically tend to be seen as symbols of sexual or political danger, of sites of bodily contestation. I'm thinking of Klaus Teweleit's book on the Männerfantasien. Or to paraphrase Cynthia Enloe, the American sociologist, she was writing about women in the American army, but I've replaced the word army with revolution in this paraphrase. Women might be mobilized to serve the revolution or represent it in allegorical form, but they can never be permitted to be the revolution. Enloe says that women can be mobilized to serve the army, but can never to serve the American armed forces, but can never be permitted to be the American armed forces. And I'm just paraphrasing that. Here, the classic use of women to represent liberty leading the people, Delacroix's painting from 1830. Well, when I began writing this, I was also thinking about how the relevance of these themes to thinking about the world today. Very sadly, earlier this year, a British woman called Anna Campbell, an anti-fascist woman who'd been involved in campaigns against the far right in Britain, was the first woman to be killed, first British woman, I beg your pardon, to be killed fighting for the Kurdish Women's Protection Units. She was killed in a Turkish air raid in March 2018, on the 15th of March. And I was interested in the way this was portrayed in the British media. This is actually a picture, I think, taken from the Daily Mail of all papers. It's interesting the gender dynamics of this, because Anna Campbell's mother had died 2 or 3 years before, I think, of cancer, and it was her father who represented the bereaved parent, and she, the soldier who had died. So it's a kind of reversal of the mourning mother symbol. And yet somehow the British newspapers don't know how to place this, or to think about how we might deal with what kind of narrative we might place on the idea of a woman fighter who dies for a revolutionary and feminist cause. So instead, the newspapers simply dwelled on the fact that the Kurdish Women's Protection Units had asked her to dye her hair black so that she looked more Kurdish in case she was captured by Islamic State or by Turkish armed forces or what have you. So she blended in a little bit more. So she's presented in a very, again, it's her body and her physical attributes that become the way this is represented. I also found in March a front page news item at the time of the Russian presidential elections in the weekly German newspaper Die Zeit. And this says, the headline of this newspaper. I'm interested in this because it makes a reference to the idea that women in Russia should be revolutionary, and yet they are no longer revolutionary. Why do they love him? Russian women and Putin. This is the title of the in Die Zeit on the 8th of March 2018, and it accused Russian women of being the ones who are going to vote Putin back into office. And there she is, the Russian woman with her T-shirt of Putin. Once she made the world her oyster, fought as a soldier, started revolutions. Today she votes for Putin as her president and lets her husband beat her. And that's literally what it says, lässt sich von ihrem Ehemann verprügeln. How the Russian woman has become something that is no longer permitted to be strong. So we've almost come full circle. We're very far away from Delacroix here. Here are Russian women leading Russia to authoritarianism and away from democracy and freedom, so to speak. So it's interesting how even today women revolutionaries are portrayed in a particular way and expected to act in a particular manner. If we go back to 100 years ago, literally today, how does this all relate to the November Revolution and the way that it has been written about in historiography? Well, one thing that we know is that this is often being portrayed as a failed revolution, as an incomplete revolution, as a stillborn revolution, as a revolution that failed to properly democratize Germany, as a split revolution. So here I've got Philipp Scheidemann on the left declaring the parliamentary republic from the window of the Reichstag building, and on the right, from just a few streets away, Karl Liebknecht declaring the Socialist Republic from the balcony of the Kaiser's Palace unter den Linden on the 9th of November 1918. These two images form the backcloth to Cold War propaganda as much as anything else, the identities of the two Germanys, the Reichstag being just on the west side of the Berlin Wall, and of course if any of you have been to Berlin Mitte, the balcony on which Liebknecht declared the Republic was kind of kept as a facade whilst the rest of the royal palace was taken down in the 1950s. The two versions of Germany, parliamentary or socialist, in 1918. And of course, then it doesn't have the overall united narrative or the world historical significance or the completeness of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. It's a divided revolution in Germany. Walter Ulbricht, the historian of the Labour movement, who happened to be also the leader of the Communist Party in East Germany, decided to write his theses on the character of the November Revolution in 1958. He called it a failed democratic revolution fought to a certain extent with proletarian methods and means. Before I started this project, I had no idea how Ulbricht could bring to life this revolution with his theses. But this is his attempt to define the revolution not only against Western interpretations, but primarily against Spartacist or more radical left interpretations of this revolution as well. In West Germany, or in the West in general, Sebastian Haffner's book, Failure of a Revolution, written in the 60s. I think it's now that the most recent editions are simply called Die Deutsche Revolution, so it's been a slightly less contentious title, but that's constantly been republished. Verratene Revolution, Betrayed Revolution, or the Swiss journalist Fritz René Allemann wrote in the 1950s a book, Bonn ist nicht Weimar. Bonn, the West Germany is not Weimar, its democracy is properly founded compared to Weimar. So we've got this very negative view of Weimar as an unstable product of a stillborn revolution and or of an unjust peace settlement. Today, we have in the guise of particularly Wolfgang Nies's book, but of other books and indeed of a speech which I believe the Bundespräsident Steinmeier is making or has made in the last day or two about the revolution of 1918-19. It's claimed now, today, in the commemorations, that 1918-19 does mark the true beginning of German democracy, that Weimar ist Bonn, and that the foundations of German democracy might well begin in 1918. This is an attempt to put a more positive spin on the events of women working in the war, that the emancipation that women had through waged work in Germany in the First World War was merely emancipation on loan. So there's a disconnect between the female experience of the home front in Germany in the First World War and this idea of the revolution as the true beginning of German democracy. Uta Daniel probably didn't intend this herself. She probably didn't choose the English language title of her book. I think in German it's Arbeiterfrauen im Ersten Weltkrieg. But The War from Within, that title, gives to me the false impression, perhaps an intended false impression, that the only war that women knew was the war on the home front, and that women are again disconnected from the soldiers' war, the sailors' war that led to the events of 9th November 1918. So although perhaps we have a slightly more positive spin on the events of November 1918 now in the commemorations, women are still predominantly left out of the narrative. Instead, again, partly also a problem with sources. The tiny number of women who were known to have been members of the Arbeiterräte. In our project, we found a few more, but not very many. Again, mean that most of the sources are by men, written by men, kept in archives that were set up by men, and so forth. What do we do instead? Well, one thing that historians do, from Klaus Teweleit to the more recent book by the Irish historian Mark Jones, is to look at violence, but through the eyes of men, right-wing men, the Freikorps. In Britain today, I teach courses on Weimar Germany, and I always find that students, not because of their political sympathies, but they will opt to write the essays about the Freikorps rather than about the revolution. They find that the notion of restorative violence committed by the right-wing Freikorps militias against the Spartakists is easier to grasp, I think. So restorative violence against women, red women, that's what Klaus Teweleit's book's all about, and against proletarian men, which is what Mark Jones's book is largely about, as a state-sponsored communicative act. Jones is interested in the Schießbefehle, the shooting orders that allowed the Freikorps to kill Spartakists in 1918-19 at Weimar's beginning. Or this comes from an article written by the British Marxist historian Tim Mason for History Workshop Journal in the late 70s. We could look at the domestication of female socialist icons. This is from a majority Social Democrat magazine, Der wahre Jakob, in February 1919, and instead of Delacroix, liberty leading the people to revolution, the woman here, the social democratic woman, has a domestic role. She sweeps up after the chaos of the revolution. Or we could look at I'll just use Dix as an example, or we could displace women entirely from German politics and look at the new woman instead, and the representations of the new woman in art and culture. Or we could do what Christine Byron did in her work on the Irish Revolution, look at women revolutionaries and their performative gestures, having pictures, posing for pictures with guns, Countess Markiewicz, or the German anti-fascist photographer who was killed on the front line in Spain in 1937, Gerda Taro, posing as revolutionaries with gun in hand. Or we could pick one or two exceptional women revolutionaries and write biographies of them. These women tend not to undermine the linear stories of the revolution told by men. Because they're exceptional, they don't undermine the idea that the revolution was gendered male. And this is late, I read an article by Hedwig Richter in Die Zeit, again a couple of weeks ago. She says, because revolutions are male affairs, when we write the history of women in the vote, we should leave out revolutions and simply look at how women won the vote after a much longer history of patient campaigning, and look at key turning points like the entry of women into higher education in Germany in 1908, or the formation of the Bund Deutscher Frauenvereine, and quite conservative figures like Gertrude Bäumer, who was pro-war in 1914, instead, that we should leave the revolution to men, she seems to say, and concentrate on women's different trajectory, women's suffrage being on a kind of different trajectory. She says, take the long view rather than focus on the immediacy of what happened in 1918. Not surprisingly, I challenge all of these ways, or Ingrid and I and Corinna want to challenge all of these different ways of writing about socialist women, and instead to look at women's autobiographical writings, or we've begun collecting them from various sources, as a means of trying to recapture the revolutionary moment of 1918-19. And I want to talk about two memoirs that I've picked up upon. One is by a woman called Hilde Kramer, who was in the Spartacist League in Munich and was the secretary to Horst Egelhofer, who was the Red Army commandant in Munich, who was shot dead on the 3rd of May 1919 when the white troops entered Munich. Hilde Kramer spent time in Stadelheim jail in Munich, where many of her male comrades were shot in the courtyard, and then she was put on trial herself but found not guilty. As a communist in the early 20s, she lived in Berlin, but luckily for her, luckily in inverted commas, because she was a Abweichler, a dissident communist who joined the KPDO in the late 20s, when the Nazis came to power, she went to London rather than to Moscow and survived. Millie Bölkler Hilde Kramer was from a middle-class background, really, but she joined the Spartacist Bund in 1916-17. Millie Bölkler was a working-class woman from a socialist family in the Ruhrgebiet, and I can't find a picture of her, so instead I've got a picture of the Institute for Marxismus-Leninismus in East Berlin, and this is where Millie Bölkler wrote her memoirs in the late 50s, early 60s for the party archive. She went to Moscow and survived the purges and returned to West Germany in the late 40s. When the KPD West was banned again in 1956, she went to the GDR and was a big campaigner in the late 50s against West German rearmament, and a representative of the Ruhrgebiet, the Ruhr area, and she wrote her memoirs, which are found to be a very useful source. I'm going to concentrate mainly on Millie Bölkler in the time that I have left. But before I move on, please note their dates of birth. These were very young women, 17, 18 years old, in the Spartacist youth movement in the Ruhr and in Munich. And when they came to write their memoirs, much later on, they really did focus very much on the moment of 1918 and what it meant for them and their revolutionary aspirations and their revolutionary concepts of citizenship as working class persons, but also as women. So I'm going to talk mainly about Millie Bölkler. Now, Millie Bölkler is interesting because she was born in Mülheim an der Ruhr, quite close to Essen. And the main point about her is that Mülheim is a garrison town. So that when Uta Daniel's book talks about the war from within, as if there's a different war from without that women aren't involved in, Millie Bölkler and her peers were very conscious of the young men who were being conscripted, barracked in Mülheim, and then being sent off to war. And that included the young men of her town. As Spartacists, they agitated outside the barracks, and they actually had members who were conscripted into the army there. So she did know them. As a woman, she did know the army. She did know what military discipline was like for soldiers. She had a fairly good idea of the horrors of the war from without as well as the war from within. Her parents were both active on the left wing of the SPD, and they later joined the Communist Party. And she joined, at the age of 15, the Freie Spartakistische Jugend, the Spartakist youth, in 1916. Why I'm interested in her is that she was in no sense a pacifist, although she was an anti-militarist all through her life, including the late 50s when she campaigned against West German rearmament. She helped her father to smuggle and distribute weapons during the 1920 Ruhr uprising, which is a very dangerous thing to do because of the Schießbefehl. If you're caught with arms by the Reichswehr, by the regular army, then you will be shot summarily in the Ruhr uprising. She was put on trial in 1921 because she was caught with communist literature, not fortunately with guns. She was acquitted, but she spent a day in prison because she swore at the judge who acquitted her. So he sent her to prison for 1 day. She went to Moscow, and she then went back to the Ruhr in the late 40s and then to the GDR after 1956. And she wrote 2 versions of her memoirs for the party archive in 1958 and 61. And I'm going to read some quotes from her memoirs. I'll translate them into English here. First of all, this idea of where her anti-militarism comes from, which is not by being involved in the war from within, but being central, having a central understanding of the war as it was fought by soldiers. In November 1918, she wrote, many of our young male comrades, young Spartacists, did not return home. Gerhard Bournes, our much-loved and talented youth leader from Mülheim in the Ruhr district, who had given us encouragement and instructions in our anti-militarist campaigns from the field, came back with a terrible jaw wound and reminded us constantly of the horrors of the war. After he died from his injuries, his burial in the cemetery at Mülheim turned into a strong demonstration of allegiance to the cause of anti-militarist youth. So one of her friends, one of the young Spartacists, was conscripted into the army, returned very injured, and then died shortly after his return from the war. She knew war, the war from without as well as the war from within. On weapons, I can no longer remember how these weapons came to be in our house. Perhaps my father, who was a member of the Workers' and Soldiers' Council in 1918 and had defended the Post and Telegraph Office against attacks from counter-revolutionary forces, had brought them home with him, or perhaps somebody had given them to him to store away. Anyway, they were in the house. Now and again, us girls, her and her sister, were allowed to help father to clean and grease them, and we were proud to help. For our family, father and mother in the Carpe Dei, 2 daughters in the FSJ, it was a matter of course to be active in the workers' movement. We all secretly nursed the hope that these weapons will be needed again in the future. And indeed, when the Ruhr uprising after the Kapp Putsch took place, out come the weapons, and she is involved in moving them between different parts of the Ruhr during that uprising. We couriers had to be constantly on duty. There was more than enough to do. Sleeping quarters and refreshments had to be provided for the Red Guardists. Communications had to be maintained. Reports sent out. we youths were all on the scene, including many girls, who were not pleased that they were only allowed to act as messengers and medical orderlies. So in the late 50s, she's showing her Eigensinn here, I think, her opposition to certain tropes about how it was only men who did the fighting in the revolution. She's protesting against the domestic role that even the Spartakists supposedly wanted to place her in. She remembers the women who nursed and looked after the white Gardists, dressed in white tunics and red and white headscarves. Many of them were brutally murdered by the brutish white troops. In Dinslaken, 6 women who had cooked for the Red soldiers were sentenced to death and shot on the market square. When the comrades found out that Margareta Beker from Lunen was to be shot, they organised a demonstration. They sent a number of children to the prison, and this is in the Ruhr, who sang a revolutionary song when Margareta was led out into the courtyard. Deeply moved, but with dignity and composure, she cried out to the assembled proletarians, "Ich sterbe für die Freiheit, I die for freedom," which is a common revolutionary trope for men to use, but it's interesting that she's put this idea into the mouths of a woman revolutionary who was caught with weapons, and under the Schießbefehl that the Reichswehr operated under, they could summarily shoot her. So we go back, I'm coming to the end, we go back to Cynthia Enloe, the American sociologist, and she says women might be mobilized to serve the revolution, but they can never be permitted to be the revolution. The historiography that we have and the commemorations that are going on today on the centenary of the revolution seem to bear this out. But as well as having a sociological explanation, I think it's also very important that we historicise this properly as well and think about 1918-19, think about the post-war era as a particular historical period. Borrowing from the words used by the American historian Kathleen Canning, I think that we shouldn't take, when we're looking at revolution, at suffrage, it's the wrong path to take to look at the long term. What we want to do is to recapture the historical moment of rupture in 1918. And only by doing this can we move beyond narratives of the revolution as male-gendered, with women simply featuring, if at all, as passive beneficiaries. Rather, we need to connect the November Revolution with new ways of imagining, desiring, claiming citizenship at a moment of profound revolutionary crisis, ensuring that there was no return to gender normality after 1918. We have to go back to 1915, the battle against food shortages, against police brutality, and against militarism, and to notice how these create new political languages of citizenship, which were unthinkable or unsayable before 1914, because women did not have a revolutionary script before then. By saying that, I'm taking a point made by Moritz Fulmer in his essay in Past and Present, when he talks about men not having a revolutionary script in 1918, because the revolution wasn't like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. But I think equally that women only developed a revolutionary script, certainly the women whose memoirs I've looked at in the party archive, through their experience of a moment of rupture in 1918, rather than the experience of being part of a longer-term trajectory. The script, therefore, only emerges as a result of the intensity of the events of 1918 to 20. Nadina Rossel, again, has written about men. She found some essays written by young men in Essen in 1918. And I agree with everything that she says, except that she says it about men, and it could equally well be applied to revolutionary women. You've just got to find the sources on revolutionary women. The revolutionary script for women could no longer be contained within older languages of class discipline and Marxist theory. They could no longer, in other words, be contained solely within Luxemburg or Zetkin or Engels on the family and so forth. It was the war, the common thing that Ingrid and Corinne and I have found in all the memoirs we've looked at, that come from social democratic, independent socialist and communist memoirs, is the notion that it was the war that educated us. Whether it's working class women or middle class women involved in social work of various kinds in Germany during the war educated us. So I want to go back to Hilda Kramer, a young woman who although middle class, had lost her parents quite young and was brought up by step-parents and was involved in radical Munich politics at the end of the war and the beginning of the peace. And she says something very, very interesting in her memoirs that were published by her son in England, her son who was living in England, published in Germany a few years ago, but after her death. She died in 1974. In the last months of the war in Munich, I made strenuous efforts to educate myself as a socialist and discovered just how little I knew. I frantically swatted up on Wages, Prices and Profit and other pamphlets which were supposed to open up a new world to me, but in fact merely convinced me that I could never grasp anything about scientific socialism. My beliefs were not based on abstract knowledge, but solely on my own feelings. These feelings in turn came from observations that I made myself and on my revulsion towards a society that could bring about a war like this one. So just as for male soldiers and sailors, this was an anti-militarist revolution against war and military discipline, so for the revolutionary women that I've looked at, this was a war against militarism, a revolution against militarism whose script was only written in the period from 1915 onwards. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful paper. And now the questions. Anyone? Okay. And then.
Yes, thank you very much for this wonderful paper, and I do agree to see it's necessary to see this rupture here, but I wouldn't be so hard on the long-term perspective, because I think we have to see it in a certain context. Hedwig Richter and others are also reacting to a book by Jad Adams, who tried to look at a world history of the vote,
yes.
and which is a very difficult book, and I have also written something about it. He emphasizes the need to see the introduction of the vote in revolutionary context and so on, but he doesn't write anything about it, and he how do you say that? He oh dear, now the word is missing. He really pulls down the whole suffrage movement that was there before. He says it's not important at all in the end, okay? And that's the context, I think, that these articles are now appearing, saying, no, we have to remember the whole story of suffrage and not just look at the introduction in 1918. That's what I wanted to comment, okay?
Yes, fair enough. I'm simply thinking about the way in which the anniversary both of suffrage and of the revolution is being portrayed. And if the revolution is the true beginning of German democracy, particularly as Nice says, then how do we fit that in with a narrative that suggests that suffrage is the product of many decades of campaigning? I think without being able to say that women were involved in this revolution and that their vision of suffrage included, their vision of citizenship, revolutionary citizenship, included, of course, suffrage, but a lot more besides, then we've kind of lost something about the revolution. And my reaction is really against this idea that the revolution was male in character and that women simply passively picked up the vote as a and that's all we need to know. And then when we look at Weimar women, we're really looking at the new woman and cultural representations of women, but not really at women as active creators of citizenship. I think that was important, and democratic citizenship as set out in the November Revolution itself.
So thank you for this interesting lecture. I would like to ask you if there is any difference, because I saw that you also analyzed those autobiographies.
Yes.
If there is any difference between, there is a revolutionary class and then there is the revolutionary avant-garde who leads the revolution.
Yes.
If this is seen maybe in these autobiographies, these differences between the,
Yes, of course. I mean, if we look at the late 1950s, all memoirs have to be written according to the Leninist avant-garde theory, which Ulbricht subscribed to, or at least Ulbricht's version of Lenin. In 1956, Ulbricht was in a real problem. He had to reinvent Leninism to de-Stalinize it, but nonetheless to reassert party discipline. And one way to do this is to say there cannot have been a proletarian revolution in Germany in November 1918 because Germany lacked a vanguard party. The party was only formed in December 1918, so it can't have, November 1918 cannot have been a revolution in the Lenin sense. Therefore, it has to be a failed bourgeois democratic revolution. And of course, these memoirs are written in that style. They know that they have to be written in that style. But when you read between the lines, you see a challenge to this avant-garde theory, the idea that the war educated us and that feelings and emotions can be an important part of our education as socialists suddenly comes to the fore in these memoirs. And the idea of a Leninist avant-garde, or even the idea of being very knowledgeable about Luxemburg and Liebknecht and Engels and so forth, it takes secondary importance to the immediacy of the war. But the avant-garde, the Leninist-style avant-garde theory is supposed to prevent any of these narratives really from getting to the fore. So, yes, the memoirs they've got both of them in there, and I think probably in some cases quite deliberately. They have to conform. It's part of a deal to be rehabilitated to write this. People like Millie Bölkler and one or two others, Marta Globig, who lost her husband in the Gulag, and others, could trace their party roots back to the Spartacist League. So every year in Neues Deutschland, there's a picture of them. We celebrate the birthday of our esteemed party veteran, who is today a forebuilt, a model for anti-militarist youth today in the 1950s, when the GDR youth are fighting against West German armaments and nuclear war and so forth. And yet nothing is said in these birthday greetings about the 20 years spent in the Gulag, which is astonishing. It's absolutely Orwellian in its scope. Does that answer the question about avant-gardism? I mean, I suppose these memoirs challenge the official line on what avant-garde means, and thereby offer a new quasi-Spartacist reading of the revolution.
Anyone else? Other questions? We are all tired or something? Maybe one question from my part. You spoke about memoirs and so on, but did other contemporaries, let's say from other parties,
Yes.
recognize this important active role of women right from the beginning, for example?
No.
No.
There's very, very few examples of this. Ernst Toller was one of the leading revolutionaries in Munich in 1919, and he was tried in absentia and sentenced to death. And he was hidden in a safe house by a woman, but that doesn't feature in any of his writings. That he was well aware of the role of women in the revolution, but he didn't write women into his plays about the revolution, and nor did he mention the fact that he was rescued from a death, from being arrested by the White Guardists by a woman. And even when challenged by Joan Littlewood in early 1930s Manchester, he still wouldn't accept that women had played anything more than a symbolic role in the revolutionary events. Most revolutionary women themselves, or those who wrote official memoirs, like they had to demarcate themselves from bourgeois feminists and pacifists. So they will take the class line, and they will underline their revolutionary credentials by deliberately not talking about women's rights and by claiming to have read Engels and or taking their perspective on gender questions from theoretical Marxist writings rather than from their own experiences. Hilde Kramer's biography criticizes both Kurt Eisner, the revolutionary leader in Munich, whose government had her arrested for the first time in February 1918, and she also criticizes Eugen Levine, one of the leading revolutionaries who was executed by the White Guardists in May 1918 because of his condescending view of her as a Spartacist. He said that she was called in 1918 he called her a schoolgirl and told her to leave the Spartacist business to the men, which she refused to do. So Eisner's government ordered the arrest of about 12 Spartacists for organising a demonstration in the centre of Munich in February 1918. She was the only woman among them, and she was written out of. She was really written out of the story of the events in Munich between November 1918 and May 1919 as well. The women are invisible in most of this, not only in the historiography, but in memoirs and in plays written by people like Toller. They are, and then of course in Die wahre Beginn unserer Demokratie there's no women in that story really as well. The true beginnings of Germany's democracy is a male story. Yeah.
Another question?
Thank you. Of course, this is a very important rehabilitative effort to try to put women back in the picture into the revolution, which is brilliant. You've done it incredibly convincingly. I'd like to ask actually the flip side of that, and whether there's a need to put women back into the story of the Freikorps, and whether there's a book in my own field, which you might be familiar with, R.M. Douglas's book, Feminist Freikorps, which is actually about Britain. But at the same time, is there a need for this kind of, I know you're a historian who's worked a lot on fascist women as well. So is there a need to do the same thing for the opposite side of the spectrum at this moment in history?
No, because it's been done much more extensively. Johanna Gehmacher on who's the Kitty Schirmacher, who probably wasn't in the Freikorps, but she was certainly on the nationalist right, on the Völkische Frauenbewegung in Austria, at least in German and Austrian historiography, there's quite a lot now written on right-wing women and their involvement in the Freikorps. And if you read some of the most recent overall texts on the war after the war, the long Great War up till 1923, the only things that are written about women and violence are right-wing women, there's nothing on the idea that left-wing women might have had guns in hand or at least been involved in smuggling or keeping guns. So, although yes, right-wing women and violence is interesting, and there's probably a bit more to say, as we sit here today, there's much more written on that, and it's already written into Gerwart and Robert Gerwart's book and other books, whereas there's very little about this. Also, how can we write about right-wing women in the same sentence as Der wahre Beginn unserer Demokratie? We can't. There's no story to tell there about the democratic beginnings of. These are the authoritarian right-wing women as well. We can talk about the true beginning of fascism, I suppose, in the Freikorps, but not so much the true beginning of democracy.
I mean, I take your point in historiographical terms, but what in actual numerical terms? What about proportionality within the movement? Gender proportions on the far right.
Yes. I mean, numerically, the left-wing women appear to be much more invisible. They are visible in police records, but not so much in the archives kept by the left itself. Whereas I think right-wing women are still still appear to be given paradoxically more license by the right-wing men to breach gender norms in what was then, by the right wing in particular, seen as the state of emergency, the Ausnahmezustand, the state of emergency that meant that everything had to be done to save Central Europe from Bolshevism of the type that Luxembourg represented. Yes, numbers are very, very difficult. When we began this project, we began the only literature really on the number of women involved in the workers' councils in Germany was that there were 2 women members of the Council's Congress in Berlin in December 1918. And Ingrid likes to begin her talk sometimes with the anecdote about them, about the opening of one of these council congresses where the speaker begins, gentleman and lady, because there's this one woman in the audience. We found a few more women who were members of local councils, but really not very many at all. And if we want to write about women in the revolution, we have to write more about, in Kathleen Canning's style, or following Kathleen Canning's model, about women and the imagination of citizenship, rather than the institutional frameworks in which they might have operated. Whereas with right-wing women, I think there is more of an institutional framework and that can be worked around.
Thank you.